Anyway, yeah, I interviewed Bill Pedersen about his career. Where do I even start? Are there any points in your presentation upstairs that you want to elaborate on down here? Anything you really like talking about?
Well, you know, when you look at 50 years of work, you can't help but be cognizant of the fact that, you know, you worked with a lot of people. And without those people, none of it would have happened. And so I think that I made the statement upstairs that I probably remember the relationships and the collaborations that I had as much as I remember the projects themselves. And one of the wonderful things about winning this award is that I've invited a large percentage of those people back to be here today, and they are. And so I made an effort as I was going through various projects to try to identify those individuals, because they contributed a great deal to me, they contributed a great deal to the projects themselves, and in the end, one of the most satisfying things that we've done together, my partner Gene Kohn and I, and formerly Shelley Fox, who's no longer alive, is that we've created a sort of a living entity that is producing, we like to think, better architecture each year. And that's something in itself that gives us a lot of satisfaction. And the buildings, the opportunities we've had have been brought about as a product of the dynamic of our internal relationship. I mean, we've had incredible opportunities around the world. And one of the most unique things about it is that you walk into our office in New York or in London or Hong Kong or wherever, and you virtually see a small segment of the global community altogether. I mean, we have a very high percentage of Asians in our office, as you would imagine, because we have a high percentage of Asian work. But we have 33 languages represented in our office. And, you know, that is the sort of thing that's happened in the last 15 years, 20 years maybe. And that has been a transformation that has been sort of unprecedented, I think, and certainly in architectural history, to be able to have this sort of dynamic within one's workplace. And so the social aspects of architecture have been as meaningful to us as the actual physical production of our buildings.
50 years in the business, and obviously a lot has changed, and the international aspect of it is certainly one thing, but my guess is you probably never would have imagined 50 years ago that you would be designing buildings as tall as you are now, and all of a sudden your firm is positioned as one of the world's premier developers of super tall buildings.
50 years ago, I showed a photograph of an image that a building I had designed at the University of Minnesota 50 years ago. It was my own elective assignment. I wasn't asked to design a tall building, but I did. And I seemed to have sort of a natural affinity for it. Although I don't think that even a percentage of the opportunities would have been available to me to design the tall building had I not been involved in a partnership with Gene Kohn. It's as simple as that. I mean, Gene has been the dynamic which has really brought our message to the world in a sense. So the two of us have initially worked extremely well together to make these opportunities come about. And when you say 50 years ago, I would never have dreamed that I would be involved in buildings of this height. No, I certainly could not have conceived of it. But height in itself, or scale, or size has never been much of an objective for me personally. I have a tremendous enthusiasm for designing chairs, for example. And so the issues that really attract me to the nature of the tall building were very well illustrated, I think, today in a presentation made by the young architects from Singapore, who did this magnificent housing complex that started to demonstrate the potential of human interaction in a vertical organization. And that, to me, is really the future of the tall building. You know, tall buildings that tend to be sort of autonomous and isolated as objects have never been an interest to me, as beautiful as the objects are. The tall buildings that interact with each other are those that are, to me, the most important. I didn't answer the question today, what was my favorite building that I didn't design in the tall building category. I didn't answer it well. For some reason or other, I don't know how it escaped me, but the building that has set, to me, the example of what the potential of the tall building is has always been the Rockefeller Center in New York. And that the joining together of a series of buildings, each of which are gesturing to each other, each of which are creating spatial relationships, each of which develops sort of a dynamic that exists on the ground plane, but it is also a dynamic that exists in the vertical plane as well. You know, that is a model that has never really been equaled, frankly. And the excitement and the potential of the tall building is when spatially it starts to acknowledge the excitement of its height and the ability to layer, I believe, to be able to layer a sense of escalating ground planes up throughout a structure. And that's why I was particularly moved by the presentation of the housing project in Singapore today, which I feel is really pointing towards that potential.
Maybe here's a better question. Tony Bennett was one of Frank Sinatra's favorite singers. Okay, and you're at this level, where you're one of the world's starchitects, and they ask rock stars periodically, who do you listen to? Whose work do you look at?
Boy, that's a question that the architect that I have sort of a cultural affinity and connection to is a Danish architect by the name of Jørn Utzon. Jørn Utzon designed the Sydney Opera House. Jørn Utzon did several magnificent projects which tend to sort of fall under the radar screen. He's been personally a great hero of mine, if I may say that. Looking back in time, Chicago is hard to ignore, and of course the great work of Frank Lloyd Wright is work that continues to inspire simply because of the connections it was able to make and establish with nature. And I believe that the mile-high building that Wright designed still has to rank as probably one of the greatest achievements in tall building design that exists. But I believe today the architecture that has been generated, particularly in the last 20 years, is now reaching a level that we haven't seen for a long period of time. I believe that there are architects working. Fumihiko Maki, for example, Maki in Japan has always been a great inspiration to me. I particularly admire John Nouvel's work in France, mainly because each building he designs, he responds specifically to the issues of that particular place. Every building looks different. Within our own country, last year, I believe Stephen Hole won the award for the best tall building of the world. And for me, he's always been a very powerful inspiration. One can't in any way disregard the tremendous contributions of Frank Gehry, who, as an artist, is at one level of tremendous accomplishment, but as a builder of buildings, to build these things that he's designing, that has been a whole level of contribution that Gehry has made himself that has, I believe, really broken a lot of ground. So there are a tremendous number of voices out there that are producing work that all of us are greatly indebted to and are inspirational.
You worked in I.M. Pei's studio for a while, one of the many things on your long list of accomplishments. So you worked in the master studio for a while. Of course, you're the master now, but what kind of association did you have with Mr. Pei, and what kind of things did you walk away with from there?
Well, I had a very close working relationship with I.M. I.M. had been on my Rome Prize jury, and so after I'd been in Rome for a period of time, he invited me to come back to work in his office, and I think he saw something in the work I did that was of interest to him, but when I joined his office, I felt that I really, for the first time, could understand, one, the commitment that is necessary to produce a work of architecture, and a commitment by a wonderfully orchestrated team of people, all of whom felt totally dedicated to a goal, but all of whom clearly knew that I.M. was the boss, right? And I.M. had a way of working with you such that you always felt that you could make a contribution, that you never felt that you were being given something that's all you had to do was draw it up. You always felt that you could offer him your point of view. And everybody working within the office had that sense. Extraordinarily elegant man, one of the most elegant men I've ever met in my life, had a tremendous sort of a visual sophistication that was, and I.M. and I are probably as different as people as you possibly can imagine. But yet, it was the way he worked with people within his own office that inspired me the most. I don't really design buildings like I.M. designed buildings. My interest is in other areas of design. But the way we work in the office is very similar to the way they used to work in the Pei office, or the way they do work in the Pei office. And people stayed in that office for their careers because they loved it. And we have people that have stayed in our office since they came out of school. So I think there's some similarities there.
A few years ago, when we were talking 2 years ago, your latest accomplishment was the Shanghai World Financial Center. Now with 2 years of hindsight, how's that building looking to you?
Well, that building, I think, is a tremendously successful participant in the urban landscape as a building within the fabric of Shanghai. It achieved the basic objective, which was, one, to create the tallest building, because that's what it was. That was its role, to be the tallest building at the time. They've changed the rules, but at the time it was. And to do it with a sense of serenity and presence that connected it somehow to the Chinese culture. And I've gone through elaborate explanations of how that deals with the relationship of the square, the circle, and heaven and earth and all that sort of thing. I think that was successful. I'm not so sure that the treatment at the ground level is as successful as it should be.
Where the building meets the ground?
Yeah, I think that what we tried to do is create like a small village around it. But you know, in Pudong, buildings are so isolated one from another that it's very difficult for them to make any sort of connections across those vast expanses of highway. And it's a challenge which is, maybe one can't really accomplish the objective, fully accomplish the objective, but I would like to tweak it a little bit from an architectural perspective at the ground.
Well, you have another one, International Commerce Center, that's finishing in Hong Kong now. So, and I don't know, to me anyway, the building itself looked very different than the renderings. It looks a lot better than the renderings. And is that your view too?
That building was intended to be extremely quiet. It occupies a commanding position. We entered a competition to win that building, And we wanted to design an extremely efficient building from the point of view of its surface area to the enclosed space, a whole series of things, his structural efficiency and whatever. We put a tremendous amount of energy in the surface of the building. We developed a sort of a shingled, layered skin, which enables it to reflect the sky in a way that a vertical wall cannot reflect. It has a sort of a life to it. The building's drama is not in its overall form. The building's drama is at the base, where the building comes down and sweeps into the landscape with these, we call this great dragon tail. And I think that's where the excitement is. It creates, with the Caesar Pelli's wonderful building, two sort of gateway towers into the harbor, which I think it makes for a pretty successful relationship. But the activity and the excitement of the building is in the base.
I guess the question I was getting at was, you know a building's character, a building's persona intimately from the time that you start designing it. Are there ever any surprises in the way a building comes out versus the way that you have visualized it?
Well, no, not. There aren't that many. I mean, there are certain things that you maybe have concerns about in terms of the way a surface is going to respond. But the tools that we have now to explore a building, the manner in which we can represent it in computer imagery or virtually every, and the degree to which we study a building in terms of every aspect of its detail is so complete that there are rarely any major surprises. And if there are, hopefully they're positive.
So the same feeling you get about a building, the same vibe you get off the design is indeed what comes out at the end. It's not like a child who has some surprising personality characteristics. What you see is what you get.
It's, I would say that almost, well, let me backtrack on that a little bit. 333 Wacker in Chicago surprised me. We didn't have the tools to represent it. We couldn't even model it properly with the right representation of glass, frankly. I have some humorous stories about a guy who built a model for us here in Chicago with staining the glass in his bathtub with this green dye and whatever. But so I was worried. I was worried about the relationship of the spandrel to the vision glass and how well the surface would actually represent itself. And that building did pleasantly surprise me in terms of its overall impact, at least on the river side. On the city side, I think it's got a few questions. But
and people still talk about that building all these years later.
Well, you know, a lot of people say I should have quit then, you know.
Reading about you, that was your first project. It says Mr. Pedersen's first project, 333 Wacker Drive. Your first project, how?
Well, that's the first project I'll admit to.
Okay.
No, it wasn't my first project. I did with Gene Kohn, when we were at John Carl Warnicke's office, I did a project there called the Aid Association for Lutherans in Appleton, Wisconsin. It was a relatively large corporate headquarters, a project that I'm still very fond of. So that was the first one. But this is the first tall building, 333 Wacker Drive. And I always think of it from that perspective as being my first project, yes.
I hate to keep circling back to super talls, but we always seem to find ourselves there. The first super tall building that you designed was which one?
Well, I did a competition for the Bank of the Southwest. Okay. Helmut Jahn won that competition. Mm-hmm. And I think that building was close to 90 or 100 stories high, as I recall. So it would have to fall into the super tall category, but it was at the time when I was employing a more classical series of strategies for the development of the tall building, which I acknowledged tonight in my lecture. I tend to sometimes try to maybe not just downplay, just to erase that period of my history. But when I look back at it now after a longer period of time, I see it as a very valuable period in the development of our work. And That first building, the Bank of the Southwest, was very definitely from that particular sort of aesthetic point of view.
And that was mid to late 80s, am I right?
That was almost early 80s, 83, 84, something like that. I think.
And it must have gotten you. It must have gotten you thinking in a different context.
In terms of size or height?
In terms of height.
Well, you know, Houston had a fair number of tall buildings. It wasn't like it was standing isolated. Houston, but it did. But you know, I don't want to downplay any of the accomplishments of the tall buildings that we've addressed, but tall buildings can be just very tall, nor regular buildings, just made taller, simply by structural virtuosity or whatever. The elevatoring of the building, or the basic organization of the manner in which light penetrates into the building, all this sort of thing. For example, on the World Financial Center in Shanghai, are not terribly different than a conventional office building. That's why I'm particularly excited about this latest building I'm working on, the Hyundai building in Seoul, Korea, which creates an internal spatial biology within the building itself that transforms sort of the sense of community one has within the building, and that to me it starts to point towards the potential of the tall building, not just making it a tall regular building, but something that transforms its organization from a social perspective.
This brings us to the two questions that we're asking of all of our interviewees this year about the future, the past and the future of the tall building. Petronas Towers surpassed Sears Tower in 1997 to become the tallest building in the world, and it's changed hands several times, but what in your mind has been the greatest accomplishment or the greatest thing in tall buildings in the last 10 years, in the first decade of the new century?
I believe that the technical evolution of the tall building is inevitable. I think it's from a technical perspective, whether it's structural or whether it's environmental or from a sustainability issue, I believe that a great deal of progress is going to be made with the tall building. For me, what is not inevitable is sort of the human evolution of the tall building. And so I would have to say that the greatest contributions to the tall building fall maybe more in a programmatic area in what a tall building contains. First of all, I believe a very tall building has the responsibility to ultimately be a civic symbol. It's not just a symbol of private enterprise. I think it really has to express its responsibility to a collective community. I believe that the tall building, the very tall building, has the potential to create such a diverse programmatic juxtaposition that it can be virtually thought of as a city within a city. And that concept is particularly evolving in Asia, that these tall buildings are programmatically extremely diverse. And I would give our client, Mr. Mori, great credit in the World Financial Center for the manner in which he brought together very diverse pieces of a program to create a tall building, which, when I said it was a normal building just made tall, from the point of view of its dimensions, yes, but from the point of view of its program, that building is extremely, I think, extremely adventuresome. And the observation platform on that building, which is a pretty exciting thing to be in, that generates as much income as 8 floors of the office building do down below. So it's good business as well as being a civic gesture. Below that, Mr. Mori introduced with Tony Chi, the wonderful interior designer, this incredible complex of restaurants that sits in a vertical volume of 3 stories in height. And the place is jammed, 365 days a year. It's just incredibly successful. So, I think this is really pointing the way to what the tall buildings can become. and that to me is the biggest accomplishment of the tall building in the last 10 years.
Which leads into the second question: what are these buildings going to start to look like in the mid to latter part of this century? Because we think of tall buildings as being tall, skinny, linear creations of various proportions. Is that going to continue, or are some new forms perhaps possible?
I think the tall building is perhaps going to evolve geographically in Asia at this point in time more than any other place in the world. There's a demand for it, and people there feel very comfortable living with density. It's something that is for them a natural way of life. The tall building, as it increases its lateral dimension, has the greater potential to increase this spatial complexity that I was hinting at. And that's why today I showed a slide of my project at Baruch College in New York, which is not a tall building in a conventional sense, but it's a large, bulky building that has within it a whole complex interrelationship of vertical spaces, which are fantastic to be in. And I think that I see as being sort of the next evolution of tall buildings, where they're going to get broader, but they're going to be more porous internally, so that people can really start to sense that they're participants in a community, not just stratified layer by layer. And that, is to me one helpful from the perspective of just the very tall building's lateral stability, the dimensional increase. And two, from its social perspective.
I know that I've written about a lot of 1950s era highway projects and building projects that literally tore communities in half because they divided them and there were no connections. And a lot of people here at this gathering this year have talked about interconnectedness between tall buildings, as you have. Is that starting to happen now?
Oh yes, today's award that was given to the project in Singapore and last year's award that was given to Stephen Hull's project in Beijing, point towards that direction. I think that is something that is inevitable, and how one brings the density to each of these vertical layers, I think, is a big challenge. These programs that one introduces up in the sky have got to work, and the only way they can work is to have enough people there to actually make them work, and that's always a big challenge. Retailers are really wonderful people to talk to about how does something work, and we do a lot of work in that area, and the manner, but retailing one sees already is becoming much more adventuresome from the perspective of bringing people up and allowing them to have experiences not just in the first three levels, but higher up within a building.
Well, one thing you said about Shanghai World Financial Center is that people are encouraged to go in the building and go up, which is not always the way that we grew up with buildings here in Chicago.
Yes, and that's because they have a sense of civic participation. People are invited into them. That it's not, you're not going into a private precinct, but you're going into something that really invites people and wants people to come into it, and how one coordinates all of that to allow for the inevitable privacy of certain aspects of the building and the public nature of the other aspects of the building is a planning challenge, but it certainly can be accomplished.
So how are the designs of the interior designs of these buildings changing? Because if people are going to live and work in them and basically never leave them, it's got to look a little bit better than an office in an apartment building.
Well, I'm not saying that I shouldn't leave them. I don't mean to say that one is going to have a captive audience within these buildings and have to stay in them for 24 hours a day. But the internal environment within them was a very interesting question that was asked today at the conference when the woman that was representing the Bank of America asked, she said, close your eyes and visualize the place you'd really like to be. And then she said, I bet no one said that they visualized an interior space, right? And I guess that's the challenge, that creating spaces that have a very strong sense of civic participation internally with them that are exciting. And people love shopping malls, good shopping malls, and particularly in Asia, Mike. And why? Because, you know, you feel like you're coming to the town square. And I think that's why tall buildings have got to increase their capacity to give sort of a sense of civic interaction.
So we've talked about 50 years in the business, and we've ended looking forward, which is probably appropriate because you're still the guy whose telephone rings when people need stuff,
well,
which is great. What's on the burner these days?
In my office, I myself doing a lot less international travel. I do a lot of the academic work in our office. A lot of the smaller projects. I'm working on furniture. I do a lot of things because that are, you know, not on the level of the world's tallest building. Our office is now being led by a whole series of young design people that are experiencing these opportunities as they should. And for me, I'm very happy to design a fork. To me, that's the ultimate challenge. I don't think I could ever do a good fork. So.
Well, I want to thank you for dropping by again because it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, and congratulations on your award.
Thank you. Thank you so much.